The end was ugly and quick. In an ironic twist, he was the one who looked strangely dignified, while his taunting executioners appeared sadistic. A shaky cell phone video, the final testament to a man's life. Saddam Hussein had a certain straightforward, brutal efficiency as he propelled himself towards absolute control of Iraq. And he kept that power with the same heavy, often vicious hand. It was a trick he learnt early in life.
Here is a boy who grew up not knowing who his father was, teased by the kids in the village about his mother's reputation. His stepfather was a very sort of abusive man. He was brutally deprived from his childhood. At the age of 9, walking around the village with an iron bar in his hand because the children teased him about his mother's reputation. And he learned an early lesson that a 9-year-old with an iron bar is stronger than a teenager.
It was this kind of ruthless force that stuck with Saddam, and over time, it was a skill he perfected.
Like a lot of dictators, you know, I presume that Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin would have been the same. They had a certain charisma, is not the word, but a certain something which got them to the top. But I was very well aware when I saw him, of course, of his record as a dictator and an utterly ruthless man. But then a lot of people who get to the top are ruthless.
Saddam's Sunni-dominated Ba'ath Party took control in Iraq in 1968. And at just 31, he became the country's second most powerful man, next to President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. Still little known outside Iraq, Saddam was quick to make an impression when he had the chance.
Someone came and said to me in Arabic, Mr. Deputy would like to invite the British generous delegations to his table. And there was a very well-groomed, very charming gentleman sitting there, invited us, and he was smoking a foot-long cigar. And he asked us in not very good English, but understandable English, what would we like, gentlemen, to drink? And I said, what are you offering? And he said, how about the Iraqi national drink? And we said, oh, fantastic, yes. It turned out to be Johnny Walker Black Label whiskey. He was a very good drinker.
You spent time with your family?
But Saddam didn't just adopt Western drinking styles. He also adopted Western movie stars as his heroes.
It was Godfather Part 1. And that was his favorite film. And he must have spent about an hour giving this analysis of what he thought of the film, the whole symbolic thing. In fact, every time I meet him or every time I looked at his politics, I think goes back to that impression he had, or the film, the impression the film had on him.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
With Saddam as the power behind the throne, the early 1970s was a period of rapid modernization in Iraq. It was the first major oil boom, and the dramatic rise in oil prices meant benefits for Iraq's infrastructure and its social system, and Saddam was the person who got the credit.
One has to understand that Saddam, for all his terrible faults, did have a vision for Iraq. He set it out in many speeches and indeed in books. And his vision of Iraq was that it should be a major player, not only in the region, but on the world scene. And he had the means to achieve that end. Enormous oil wealth, well-educated, well-motivated people. And he undoubtedly did a lot of things for the benefit of the people. He brought things that we accept as normal, education, health, water, electricity, to the most remote corners of the country, where previously these things simply did not exist. There were many parts of Iraq that were extremely primitive. So there were benefits, and people, provided that they didn't seek to oppose him and just kept their heads down and got on with their lives, had a reasonable way of life.
Definitely in the case of Iraq, Saddam gave us a lot of things. There were the development of the country, of the city particularly. There were always cars and gifts and all of these things being given. But I think what he took away from us in the meantime was actually our very souls. We got into a stage where we were fearing each other, where husbands and wives do not talk to each other, where parents are afraid to express anything in front of their kids because the teachers often ask the kids, what does your daddy think of Uncle Saddam and what does your mommy think of Uncle Saddam? And there are horror stories of parents being executed because of the child.
In this climate of fear, Saddam oversaw the killings of some of his own people.
The second time we met him was actually well into the mid-70s, and he was already by that time, I think, the deputy chairman of the ruling party, the chairman of the Revolutionary Council, and he was leading the war against the Kurds. It was quite brutal, and obviously, again, for us journalists, we were sort of neutral there, but it still was difficult for us to accept how can a government-led campaign be that brutal and that inhumane and that destructive.
Saddam wasn't interested in being second in command forever, and by 1979 he'd forced President Hassan al-Bakr to resign, and then he took aim at anyone he saw as a threat. Dozens of Ba'athist officials were singled out by Saddam at a party conference in Baghdad. Some were in the room at the time, and despite their pleas for mercy, were led out and immediately executed. It was vicious, swift and methodical, and Saddam had it all filmed for distribution across the Arab world. As his power increased, so his personality cult grew.
Every single Iraqi child was taught to call him Ammo or uncle. We sang for him, we danced for him, we wrote poetry for him, we painted for him in school. That was our training. I saw him as just Uncle Saddam, and I saw him throughout my teenage life as the brutal dictator that committed so many crimes against so many people in Iraq. And it was a parallel scene that I had to survive with and adjust with. And one of the survival skills that my mom taught me is that I have to smile when he smiled, I have to cry when he cried, I have to watch every single feeling I have and not express it, because as my mother said, he knows how to read eyes.
The 1980s were marked by the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam was encouraged and supported by the United States.
The man was a cruel dictator, came to power by force, he killed many people. But the thing that has been avoided is the links that he had with the United States. There are pictures of him in Rumsfeld, I think, aren't there? And the Americans armed him, backed him when the Shah was overthrown. And it was totally cynical, the American attitude.
Along with the United States, much of the Arab world sided with Iraq in a war that had no winner. It left hundreds of thousands dead on both sides. But somehow the legend of Saddam as a great warrior remained intact.
We were taken as journalists by the Iraqis to an area which they claim to be in control of, where they were actually subjected to a severe attack by the Iranians, counter-attack. And then we were rushed into a bunker because the shelling and the rockets were quite heavy. And in the bunker, Saddam Hussein actually was there holding a telephone and directing the battle, which again is something that Stalin and Hitler used to do. He doesn't have much of a military background. But once he's actually in the bunker, instead of actually taking a back seat like Prime Minister would do, for example, and let the generals or the colonel in charge run the battle, he was insisting on running the battle, and it was actually going wrong.
By now, Saddam's reputation was preceding him.
My first meeting with Saddam Hussein was in '87, and after I finished my training as a double of Uday, I was really shaken because what I was hearing about the president. Just when I met him, he was so soft, nice, complete different picture of what was passing to the Iraqi people. And he joked with me, he laughed with me, and he said to me, Allah gave me 2 sons and you are the 3rd one. Please ask for anything you want, just don't make me angry.
In 1990, Saddam, fresh from his failure against Iran, took on another challenge. He marched his troops into Kuwait, and 350 passengers on board a British Airways flight that had stopped to refuel in Kuwait City found themselves caught in the crossfire, held for 5 months as human shields at strategic sites.
I wrote to Saddam Hussein in 1990 after he'd invaded Kuwait and had arrested the British hostages, and I went to try and persuade him to release all the British hostages, which he did. But I had a 3-hour talk to him, and what was interesting was his sense of utter betrayal by the United States. He said they armed me, they supported me. The ambassador in Baghdad, American ambassador, said you could go into Kuwait, and now they've turned on me. Very interesting.
President Saddam, he always think about America, they are foolish. They don't understand anything in this world. They never travel, they don't know anything outside the area. And just they believe, you know, what the president say. They are the dictatorship, not us.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
And about the George Bush, the father, he always called him stupid.
I was invited to interview Saddam. They didn't tell me at the time it was Saddam. They said, put on a jacket and a tie and be downstairs at 4 o'clock this afternoon. When I got to the lobby of the Al Rashid, I was met by 4 crew-cut young men who took me back upstairs and proceeded to give me the once-over. They checked my clothing, they stripped me naked, they looked at my extremities, and I was required to wash my hands and disinfect it. And they didn't give me mouthwash, so I presumed whoever I was going to meet I didn't have to kiss. And it was Saddam, the interview with Saddam they were preparing me for. And it was one of the great moments of my journalistic life.
The Kuwait invasion was to sow the seeds of Saddam's downfall as powerful allies deserted him. In January 1991, American-led forces launched a massive assault on Iraqi troops occupying Kuwait.
Saddam had been demonized as the Hitler of the Middle East and the butcher of Baghdad. And so I didn't quite know what to expect, even though colleagues had interviewed him before the war. But in comes Saddam eventually, and he's impeccably dressed, dark blue suit, and very affable, pleasant. In fact, he said, ask me anything you want. Of course, in the interview, he was quite confrontational, but I think it was valuable in that he indicated he would not use weapons of mass destruction. This is a time when he had weapons of mass destruction.
Within 6 weeks, the Iraqi troops had withdrawn from Kuwait, battered and defeated. Washington had bombed Baghdad, but decided to pull back from an all-out assault on the capital, leaving Saddam still in power, and he still had some powerful friends.
Я привозил подарки, это было как-то принято, дарил ему там сабли.
I bought presents, it was the custom. I gave him swords, silver and golden, paintings. Winter in Moscow was one, vases, chessboards, expensive presents, that sort of thing. He gave me presents too. He gave me 2 Patek Philippe watches. They're very expensive. I was always given photographs. Only official TV crew and a photographer were allowed during our meetings. And before my departure, I was always given a set of photos that I brought back to Moscow.
Набор фотографий, которые я потом привозил сюда, в Москву.
The Iraqi people suffered under the weight of international sanctions, but Saddam continued to live like a king.
Ну, почти все дворцы его объехал, около 5-6 дворцов у него в Багдаде.
I went to almost all of his palaces. He had 5 or 6 in Baghdad. All of them were magnificent, fairy tale, beautiful. Usually there was nothing around them, only parks or empty space. The palaces were tall, beautiful, with mosaic and marble everywhere. Gold-plated doors, door handles, that sort of thing. Magnificent. Very quiet, no one around. There was a guard of honor by the doors saluting. Expensive carpets. Magnificent.
But by 2003, Saddam's luck was running out, although he seemed the last person to believe it. Washington was massing forces against him, and this time there would be no holding back.
2003, when it was obvious that Bush was going to invade, I wrote again, said could I do an interview with him. And I had a televised interview with him, and I asked him simple questions. Do you have weapons of mass destruction? He said no. I didn't know whether to believe him, but it was true. Do you have links with Al-Qaeda, which I knew wasn't the case, and he said no, and I talked about the UN and oil.
He was a commanding presence, and what was very interesting to me years later, after his capture and during his trial, that it was a broken man, and I think the years, the 90s and the early 2000s, he was approaching senility. There's no doubt about it. I mean, those years, the years of not only the sanctions, but his family problems with his sons and others, and the fact by the time the Second Gulf War started, he had handed over power and authority to his youngest son, and his oldest son, Uday, was contesting that power. And it was, the regime, I felt, was on its last stages.
And so did the American-led forces. As they rushed towards Baghdad, there was little resistance from Saddam's army, and the capital fell within weeks. Saddam had been toppled, but he was nowhere to be found. Then, 8 months later, when he emerged from a hole in the ground, Saddam had become a pathetic, ruined figure. One of two sharply contrasting images that history will have of the man.
It is a visual of a Saddam on a parade ground shooting a rifle into the air. The second is climbing out of that little spider hole he was in when he was captured, a broken man. So I look at those two, the dominating, dictatorial, charismatic leader, and the broken figure of the defeated leader in the end. And I think what is really interesting is the period between when he was firing guns and being very assertive, say, up to the early 90s, to the period when he was in that spider hole, the deterioration of his own health, of his own regime. And I'm firmly convinced that if the US had not bothered to invade Iraq in 2003, the country would have fallen into a degree of chaos, and the regime would have ended sooner than later. The difference being, I think there would be chaos, there would be brutality, but you wouldn't have American involvement in it.
Saddam's first trial began for his role in the 1982 Dujail killings. And by this time, it seemed the old, confident Saddam was back.
نراعيه كمتهم. أنا صدام حسين ما يغير. كنت رئيس جمهورية. هسه أنت متهم بقضايا جنائية.
I'm very upset because he had no fair trial. My concern is really focused that anyone in this world have to have a fair trial, have to have the right to defend himself, have to have the right to speak. So it is very sad for anyone who would see a political play, a political decision under something called legal. Sure, I'm upset because of that. He's a human.
If you're going to try a man for these crimes, it has to be International Criminal Court. And the trial in Iraq was a complete fraud. He couldn't call witnesses. He would have wanted to call President Bush's father as president, a lot of people. And I don't believe that was a fair trial. And anyway, what about the 665,000 Iraqis who died as a result of the invasion? Should Bush and Blair have been put on trial?
Outside the courtroom, the country was sliding ever deeper into civil war, a burnt-out capital where hundreds, sometimes thousands, died in a weekly cycle of huge explosions, roadside bombs and suicide attacks. By comparison, Saddam's days of confinement seemed peaceful.
I told him, anything you would like to have, you have to ask or we will ask for you. So we asked for him to have a bicycle so he can exercise. And he started exercising over that bicycle for 3-4 hours. And he told me, you know, I can have a second wife if I want. I told him, I think, sir, you are a really strong man.
The verdict was predictable. Saddam was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging.
I managed to get to him the message that he will be executed by really telling him that you are the last card to be played by Bush and Blair. And he said, I'm the last card. I said, yes, you are the last card, because Bush and Blair have no reasons to invade Iraq. All the claims were against Iraq, you know, nuclear, linked with Al-Qaeda, all these stuff has actually disappeared, proof that they don't exist. But they have you, and you are the one who they will claim we have removed the dictator. Do you think removed dictator will be for life sentence or for releasing? He said, I understand.
Saddam Hussein was led to the gallows like a common criminal. Taken from his bed before dawn, he was subjected to vicious abuse in his final moments by tormentors who told him to go to hell. His last words, "The hell that is Iraq," demonstrated that Saddam was well aware of the spiraling violence beyond his prison cell. And he must also have known that the iron rule he had once exerted over a now divided nation was becoming a distant memory.
Saddam tried to homogenize the Iraqi people, to create a society that was first and foremost Iraqi and not representing fragments of the population, ethnic or religious fractions. And now we see a situation in which the country is divided, there is ethnic cleansing going on, there is even the threat of the country becoming partitioned or falling apart into its component parts. So it is possible to see a future with virtually nothing left from Saddam's regime.